In a small town in the boot of Louisiana, there's an old abandoned hospital at the edge of the bayou that has always fascinated me and my friends. Growing up, we'd often hear stories about the eerie lights that flickered in the windows at night and the strange noises that echoed through the empty halls. The older kids would tell us about the ghostly figures they'd seen and the unexplained occurrences they'd experienced. Naturally, our curiosity grew over the years. One humid summer evening, after a particularly uneventful day, we gathered at my friend Jake's house. We were bored and looking for something exciting to do. The conversation inevitably turned to the old hospital. We had talked about exploring it before, but we never had the nerve to go through with it. Tonight felt different, though. Maybe it was the oppressive heat or the thrill of the unknown, but we finally decided to take the plunge. We spent the next hour gathering supplies, flashlights, extra batteries, and a couple of old walkie-talkies Jake's dad had lying around. We even packed some snacks just in case we ended up staying longer than planned. As we prepared, the excitement and nervous energy among us grew. By the time we were ready to leave, it was already dusk. The walk to the hospital was a mix of nervous laughter and whispered speculations about what we might find. The path took us through thick woods and overgrown trails, the sounds of the bayou creating an eerie soundtrack to our journey. As we approached the hospital, the sight of the crumbling building standing against the twilight sky sent shivers down my spine. The entrance was blocked by a rusty chain-link fence, but we found a section that had been cut open, probably by previous explorers. We squeezed through and stood at the entrance, our flashlights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Taking a deep breath, we pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The flashlight beams revealed peeling paint, broken furniture, and medical equipment scattered across the floor. We wandered through the dark corridors, the sounds of our footsteps seeming to be absorbed by the oppressive silence. Suddenly, we heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the floor above. Our curiosity piqued. We cautiously climbed the creaking stairs. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to communicate with us. We followed the sound to a room at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Pushing the door open, we found ourselves in what appeared to be an old operating room. The source of the tapping was revealed, an old, rusted surgical instrument swinging back and forth, tapping against the metal table. But what really chilled us to the bone was the figure standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was a doctor, or at least what looked like one, wearing a blood-stained lab coat. His eyes were hollow, and his face was twisted into a grotesque smile. We froze in terror as the figure slowly turned towards us, raising a scalpel in his hand. Without a word, we bolted from the room, racing down the stairs and out of the hospital. We didn't stop running until we were safely back in town. To this day, we swear we can still hear the tapping and see the doctor's haunting smile in our nightmares. The old hospital remains abandoned, a place where no one dares to venture after dark. That night was bone-chilling. We were huddled in Jake's living room, trying to piece together what had happened at the hospital. The air was thick with tension, and every little noise made us jump. Suddenly the temperature dropped, and the room was filled with an eerie silence. The lights flickered, and we could feel a presence in the room. Out of nowhere, the doctor appeared, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. He moved towards us with unnatural speed, his hands reaching out as if to drag us into the abyss. We could feel his icy grip closing around us, and the pain was excruciating. It felt like our very souls were being torn apart. We screamed and scrambled to get away, knocking over furniture in our desperate attempt to escape. The doctor's laughter echoed in our ears, a chilling sound that sent shivers down our spines. Just as we thought we were done for, the lights came back on and the doctor vanished as quickly as he had appeared. We bolted out of the house, not stopping until we were far away. Our hearts were pounding, and we could hardly catch our breath. We knew we had narrowly escaped death that night, and the encounter left us more determined than ever to find a way to stop the doctor. For weeks, everything stopped. The nightmares ceased, and we began to think we were finally free from the doctor's grasp. But then, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. We would wake up with cuts and bruises all up and down our arms and legs, as if we had been attacked in our sleep. Desperate for answers, we decided to go back to the hospital to see if we could put an end to this once and for all. But then Jake disappeared. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the hospital. I barely made it out alive, my heart racing as I fled the building. When I finally got home, I was met with a terrifying sight. Jake was waiting for me, but he wasn't the same. He wore a lab coat and held a scalpel in his hand, his eyes vacant and cold. It was as if the doctor had taken over his body, and I knew I was in more danger than ever before. It happened just a week ago. My friend and I were out walking late at night, probably around 2 a.m. The streets were quiet, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves as we smoked and chatted, trying to make sense of the world. But then, something completely unnerving broke the silence. We heard a sound, something that almost sounded like a wolf, but with a much deeper, more menacing tone. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and that's when we froze. Wolves are practically non-existent in my city, so we were immediately on edge. We looked at each other, unsure whether to walk away or investigate. But curiosity got the better of us, and we followed the sound. That's when we saw it. At first, I thought it was just a large dog, but the more I looked, the more it didn't make sense. This creature was pure black, with a shape that vaguely reminded me of a hyena, but its face, it didn't match. It looked like a wolf's face, sharp, eerie, and strangely familiar, but on a body that was all wrong. My heart pounded as we cautiously followed it, hoping to get a better look, but somehow it heard us coming from a distance. I still don't know how. The moment it realized we were there, it darted off with incredible speed, disappearing into the woods. We gave chase, but it was no use. The thing was fast and managed to slip onto someone's property before we could even catch up. We ran back to my house, adrenaline pumping, hearts racing, unable to process what had just happened. What was that thing? I'd never heard of an animal that sounded like that, or looked like that. It was like something out of a nightmare. When I finally got home, I couldn't keep it to myself. I asked my dad if he knew anything about it, and he stared at me as if considering how to explain what he was about to say. "That animal," he said slowly, "is called a sheeb. It's the result of a female hyena, Asarokon, mating with a male wolf." He paused, then added, "But I don't know if it's real or just a local myth. To this day, I still don't know if I saw something truly supernatural, or if my dad was just playing into some old twisted legend. All I know is I've never been so unsettled in..." It had only been 4 days since the Bartlesome girl disappeared. The town searched from morning till dark every day. One time, Mary Beth McGee and her twin sister Margaret barely made it home before the mandated curfew. Everybody wanted to find that little girl. Where could she have gone? Her name was Lily Bartlesome, daughter of Hank and Betty, who both owned and operated the town's only feed store. With a town populated almost entirely of farmers, you can say they did well for themselves. Lily sometimes wore clothes from the exotic traders, with all the fancy buttons and fur collars, which made the whole school jealous. But even the jealous ones could not help but like the girl. She had a sweet aura about her that made you want to get to know her. Real inviting, like warm cinnamon rolls on the kitchen counter. She wasn't the kind of girl to run off either. Lily knew better than to stray too far from home, especially with the stories folks whispered about the land beyond the wheat fields, the ones about the ghosts of old cattle rustlers, the buried bones of outlaws who never made it to trial, and the things that moved under the prairie moon, too tall to be men and too thin to be beasts. That was why the town had a mandated curfew after all. Yet come sundown on the 4th day, just as folks were giving in to the awful realization that she might never be found, a sound carried over the fields, faint at first, then rising above the rustling crops, a voice, soft, beckoning, calling for help. It was Lily, or at least it sounded like her. The voice came from the dry well on the outskirts of town, the one folks swore had been empty since the last drought. The sheriff, lantern in hand, peered over the jagged edge, and the whole town held its breath. "Lily," he called. There was a gurgling sound, followed by a cough, echoing up the well. The sheriff wiped a bead of sweat from his head with his handkerchief. "Damn it, little girl," he thought. "You better not be playing no games." Suddenly, The town bell began to chime, causing all the townsfolk to jump and exclaim, "Pa, the curfew!" A voice chimed from the crowd. "Lily," the sheriff repeated. A ragged breath came from the well, then a soft whimper. "Please, help me." The voice sent a shiver up his spine. It was Lily's voice, sure as anything, but something about it was off, hollow, stretched like it had traveled too far to reach him. The townsfolk murmured behind him, shifting on their feet. The bell tolled again. A warning. The sheriff turned to Hank Bartlesome, whose face was pale as a sheet. "Go fetch a rope," he said. "We're getting her out of there." Hank hesitated, his eyes darting to the sky where the sun dipped just below the horizon. Curfew wasn't just a rule in this town. It was survival. No one stayed outside after dark. "Now, Hank," the sheriff barked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Your girl's down there, and I aim to get her out." Hank swallowed hard, then took off toward the feed store. The sheriff turned back to the well. He lowered his lantern, trying to see how deep it went, but the light barely touched the bottom. Just darkness, thick and unmoving. Then a noise, a scrape against stone, slow and deliberate. "I can almost reach." Lily's voice came again, closer this time. "Just a little more." The sheriff froze. No child could climb a well that deep. The bell tolled once more, the last warning before nightfall. The townsfolk began retreating, whispering among themselves, their fear palpable. Mary Beth and Margaret tugged at their father's coat. "Papa, please," Mary Beth pleaded. "We have to go." But the sheriff didn't move, because something was rising up out of the well. The sheriff gripped the edge of the well, his knuckles white. His breath hitched as a hand, small and pale, emerged from the darkness below, fingers trembling as they gripped the rough stone. "Lily," he called again, though his voice was barely more than a whisper. The hand tensed, nails scraping against the rock. Then another hand appeared, too long, too thin. The fingers bent strangely, like they weren't used to moving that way. The sheriff took a step back. The lantern in his hand flickered, casting wild shadows across the ground. The sheriff's voice was gone, his lips chapped. His tongue was too dry to wet them. A face emerged next, a face that looked like Lily's, but wrong. Her skin was too smooth, stretched too tight over her bones. Her eyes were wide, round, and black as a starless sky. Her mouth curled into a smile, but it was too big, the corners stretching unnaturally. And when she spoke, her voice had that same distant echo, like it wasn't coming from her throat at all. "Help me," she whispered. The sheriff staggered back, his instincts screaming at him to run. The last trace of sunlight disappeared. Behind him, the townsfolk slammed their doors shut. Curtains were drawn. Locks clicked into place. They knew better than to be outside after sundown. The sheriff knew better too, yet he stood there, his feet refusing to move, staring at the thing that was pulling itself out of the well. It looked like Lily Bartlesome, but Lily Bartlesome had been missing for 4 days, and whatever this was, it had never been lost at all. The sheriff's heart pounded against his ribs as the thing that looked like Lily hoisted itself higher. Her limbs moved awkwardly, like a newborn calf finding its legs for the first time. The town was silent now, save for the wind rustling through the wheat fields and the faint, wet sound of something shifting in the depths of the well. "Lily," the sheriff tried one last time, gripping his lantern tighter. "What happened to you?" The thing cocked its head too far to the side, neck bending with a quiet pop. "I was waiting," it said in that same distant, hollow voice. "Waiting for someone to come get me." Something moved in the shadows beyond the well, low and slithering. The sheriff knew he should run, but his legs wouldn't obey. "You should come down," it said. "It's warm down here. They took care of me." "Who?" the sheriff croaked. The thing's black eyes glistened. "The ones under the dirt. They don't like to be alone." The sheriff felt the cold, creeping realization that whatever had taken Lily had changed her, or worse, maybe it had only made something wear her skin. He took one slow step back, then another. His boot hit a loose stone, and he nearly lost his footing. The lantern swung in his grasp, the flame casting warped shadows across Lily's stretched smile. Behind him, a door creaked open. A voice, low, warning, called out, "Sheriff, get away from there." It was Hank Bartlesome, standing on his porch, rifle in hand. His face was drawn, pale. "That ain't my girl." The sheriff swallowed hard. He turned back just in time to see Lily tilt her head back, mouth stretching open far too wide, as if unhinging like a snake's. Then came the whispering, 100 voices, 100 echoes, all rising from the well, murmuring in some language older than the town itself. The sheriff didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, the lantern swinging wildly in his grip. Behind him, there was a low guttural sound, something between a growl and a laugh. As he reached Hank's porch, the old man didn't wait. He fired a single shot into the air, then slammed the door shut the moment the sheriff was inside. The town bell rang again, though no one had pulled the rope. The sheriff and Hank stood there in the dark house, listening to the wind howl. 4 days, Hank muttered, gripping his rifle so tight his knuckles turned white. "That's how long it takes." The sheriff glanced at him. "For what?" Hank's jaw tightened. "For them to send something back." Outside, the thing that looked like Lily Bartlesome was still standing by the well, still smiling, still waiting. And then, slowly, it turned and walked back into the wheat fields, disappearing into the night. While Lily's parents and friends mourned, the town never spoke of her again.